Hello and welcome to this podcast, an in-depth and special focus on issues affecting Namibians. I am Marlies Isaacs. The Panama Papers is a giant leak of more than 11.5 million financial and legal records which exposed a system that enables crime, corruption and wrongdoing hidden by secretive offshore companies. The Panama Papers were published in the beginning of April 2016. I spoke to veteran journalist, publisher, anti-apartheid and press freedom activist Gwen Lister about this. First of all, what are the Panama Papers?
The Panama Papers is a massive leak of more than 11 million documents, which basically in a nutshell show that heads of state, criminals, celebrities worldwide have been using secret hideaways in tax havens. So there's an element of the moral elements to the story, as well as, of course, elements of illegality and corruption. And it's a huge investigation, which isn't over yet, put it that way, as these journalists go through these millions and millions of documents that they've got.
Yes, and some Namibian journalists, they are also part of this investigative efforts. How did Namibian journalists get involved?
Okay, well, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists is a huge project which involves hundreds of journalists in, I think it's up to 90 countries in the world, who all work together on collaborative global projects, especially when it comes to investigative journalism. And I think the reason that this is really significant is that the so-called traditional media, and when I say that I refer to mainly newspapers and even radio to a certain extent and television, are facing shrinking newsrooms on a sort of almost global basis at the moment. So it really makes sense for journalists across the world to work on stories that do have global impact and that can really hold power to account. So I think the significance lies there, and the amount of work, the amount of data, and all those hundreds of journalists who had to really work with encryption and in secrecy for a year to unravel a lot of these stories, I think is very, very significant for the journalist profession.
Now, how did their input, our Namibian journalists, how did their input influence some of the investigations, especially when our country is also involved?
A lot of the reporting that has been done to date on the Panama Papers, it's not finished by any means yet. You know, it's as the journalists are going through this millions of data that they're investigating all the various stories. And as you can imagine, the sort of shadowy offshore industry is something that has its tentacles in just about every country in the world in one way or another. Namibia is certainly not one of the biggest or the most significant players thus far, but obviously there is involvement. So the ICIJ, being what it is trying to find, identify, and is working with journalists and media houses in various countries as and when the investigations involve certain countries, and they bring them on board to bring on a sort of national component and do a lot of the on-the-ground questioning of the sources and so on. I think it's really a way to go.
Yeah.
And we know ourselves here in Namibia that we've just had the president unveil his Harambee prosperity plan, as it's called.
That's right.
And we know that the target for all these efforts is to try and combat the huge gap of inequality in our country and really to try to deal with poverty. And obviously that dovetails with the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And it's not only Namibia, but I think the world that is dealing with this huge inequality gap. And so I think this kind of reporting, which happens rather than on a minuscule national basis, but cross-border investigative journalism that really shows where huge amounts of money are going, money that is probably not paying, or taxes aren't being paid on that money, and how much of it could have been used to develop instead a pro-poor agenda in various countries of the world, I think is highly significant. So there are two aspects. It's really the collaboration of these journalists, the exchange of skills and learning, because some journalists in some of our countries don't necessarily have the skills that other journalists in other countries have. That sharing, I think, is an amazing experience. And then, of course, the actual trickle-down effect of this reporting that it will have, hopefully, on the anti-poverty agenda.
I am Marlies Isaacs, and thank you for listening to this podcast episode with special focus on the Panama Papers.